Hello, hello, hello. Now, today we are looking at descriptive tools that can be used in narrative writing. Or we basically can say that these are some of the techniques that we can use when we're describing setting our character in short stories. So here we are. So, what are the major elements of a narrative that we are focusing on? Well, firstly, we're looking at setting. Setting has to do with the time, place, or the mood of a story, whether it is in a rural community or whether it is a city area, whether it is, you know, um, a time in ancient days or whether we're talking about nowadays. It could be any time. And characterization, which has to do with the development of each person in the story. And we focus on characterization because we have to remember that we don't want a one-dimensional character in our stories. We want somebody that is well-rounded. So characterization gives you the authority as the writer to build or create your characters using descriptions that can go from their physical attributes to their personality. And characterization comes out in other ways as well. It comes out in gestures, it comes out in the things that your character says, and in the things that they also do. All right, the key descriptive tools that we'll be looking at are as follows. So we'll be looking at adjectives, adverbs, verbs, and figurative devices, all of which we have covered before, but we'll go into further detail. Now, adjectives are a part of speech that modifies nouns. Adjectives tell us more about a noun. So, one of the basic things, let's say you have an apple and you want to show somebody what the apple looks like, you further say it is a red apple. Suppose you want to add something further that doesn't speak to just sight, but maybe taste. It was a red, juicy apple. And so two adjectives have been added now to make it more descriptive and paint a better picture of the image that is being described. Adverbs modify verbs. So they tell you more about actions. And there are other uses of adverbs, but this is the primary focus today. Adverbs tell us more about how somebody does something, and there are different types of adverbs. So, for example, if somebody is walking, you could say that the person walks slowly. And slowly in that sentence is the adverb that is telling us how the person walks. Verbs are also another part of speech, and verbs tell us action. And for the purpose of story writing, I'd like to call them more descriptive verbs, and we'll get into that later. And the final tool is figurative devices or literary devices. And of course, we find that they're used a lot in poetry, but they're used in narrative pieces as well. And they help to enhance writing by creating an image or giving a comparison so that persons can get a clearer picture of what is being described. And some examples of the adjectives that we commonly use: cute, dazzling, fine, magnificent, good looking, stunning, admirable, attractive, handsome, fascinating. And of course, you can add these to your vocabulary list. Now, as it relates to adjectives, one of the things I like to explain to students is that everything is not nice. Sometimes we get into the habit of describing everything as nice. The food is nice. We went out and we had a nice time. Yes. And so we have to bear that in mind. And so we have to replace these words, the nice, the good, the bad, which are highly overused. And we have to find words that are more appealing and give a clearer description of what we're talking about. So we have some examples here, and we're going to look at some words that can replace it. So music, let's say we're talking about a song. Maybe the song can be, give you a moment to guess. Rhythmic, excellent. The movie, I watched a movie and it was exciting, marvelous. So we see now that instead of using the good and the bad, we can find words that actually add more value to our descriptions. The weather, it's been a cool day. The dress, it's a stylish dress. The lady is quite pleasant, and the meal was sumptuous. And so, and tasty is an alternative for that. Now, there are verbs that are dubbed descriptive because they give more vivid picture to the actions of characters. And instead of using the regular verbs that we use on a day-to-day basis, we can use verbs that more clearly show the action of the character or the degree of the action. For example, instead of walk, we can say sidle, stroll, limped. Can you tell the difference between these words? Why not search and have a look at through Google? Tell me what you think. Now, there are other verbs that we use in our stories, such as see, run, talk, and like. Can you think of any other verbs that can replace them? Of course you can. I'll give you a few minutes to think about them. So instead of see, you glance, glimpse, stare, run, run. Instead of run, you bolted through the door, sprinted, talk, they chattered, gossiped, like, it was appealing, it was enticing, I admire. Adverbs. Now, as the word says, we are adding to verbs, which means we are telling more about the verbs. So, for example, walk. You walk slowly, you walk leisurely. Number two, you see clearly and distinctly. And number three, somebody can be thinking, and we can think diligently, or we can think quickly when it is something that you have to think fast about, or you have a decision to make in a short period of time. Figurative language or literary devices are, of course, used to make a comparison. And so if you're describing something, a scenario, a character, or the setting, you can add a figurative device, and that can extend your description and create a more vivid description. So the first one is a simile. And a simile is basically a comparison between two things using like or as. to say somebody is as fit as a fiddle. All right. A metaphor is a comparison as well. But in this case, you call one thing another. So somebody can be, you know, angry or upset, and you say, when he's upset, he's a monster. And that in itself is metaphoric, because instead of saying that the person is like a monster, you basically call the person a monster. All right. Personification. Now, this is where inanimate objects take on human-like qualities. So perfect examples are when the tree dances in the wind or the sun smiles. All right. And these also help to add to an image that is described. One of the common devices that I know students use and I think really helps in narrative writing is alliteration, where the initial consonant, letter, or sound is repeated in at least 2 or 3 words consecutively. So this would be a wonderful way to build your story's excitement, um, to play on words a bit. Tried, true, and tested friend. That is an example of alliteration. And see the play on the t sound. So these are the main devices utilized, and there are many other literary devices. And these help to cement an image. So we can use our adjectives and adverbs, but when we also include our figurative devices, that also helps to build the image that we're creating. Let's look at these. Can you name the figurative device? Let me give you a couple of minutes. So the first sentence, the tires screeched as the vehicle came to a sudden stop. All right. Now, this is a perfect example of onomatopoeia. An onomatopoeia is where the word mimics the sound, or some persons say the sound mimics the word. And the word in question here is screeched. And when we hear the word screeched, we can actually hear the tires as the vehicle comes to a complete stop. Then we move on. The audience was mesmerized as the main performer sang like an angel. And that, of course, you guessed it right, is an example of simile. So the singer did exceptionally well and sang like an angel to show you how beautiful it was. And of course, a simile is a comparison using like. And let me point out, not every word with every sentence with like or every sentence with as can be described as a simile. Remember that there must be a comparison. And number 3, Grandfather Paul was an icebox. He didn't show any emotion. And we know Grandfather Paul is not literally an icebox, but because he didn't show any emotion, then we can clearly see why the comparison is made there. All right. So yes, this would be an example of metaphor. And so, guys, if we include examples of these in our sentences, we can see how clearly the audience will grasp our descriptions. Let's look at the beginning of a story. I sat on the hard steps of cold stone in front of the large brick building, watching younger children play. I looked up and saw someone's shadow. The person it belonged to stood staring at me, taking me in. Wild gray hair, as stiff as wire, erupted around his face and from under his old hat. Icy blue was the color of his eyes. His withered face was as cold and without expression as uncarved marble. His eyes let go of mine, and I took a glance at the rest of him. He wore old boots worn through in many places. I could see parts of his feet protruding. He wore no socks, and what I could see of his feet was blistered and bruised. He caught me staring and grunted in reply. He started up the stairs. He sat carefully on one of the steps. Now, if you examine this, in the first sentence, we get a picture of the setting where the character was. And the character was at some kind of park. But we got an idea of the building and the steps. They were hard steps and they were made of cold stone. All right. And in this case, we notice that the writer made use of adjectives to bring this out. So the steps are described as hard, and the adjective there is hard. And the stone is described as cold. And as we go further in that sentence, we say that the building is a large brick building. All right. And this is a perfect example of using adjectives to bring out an image. All right. So everybody notices full use of adjectives here. If we move into the second paragraph, the person it belonged to stood staring at me, taking me in. Wild gray hair, as stiff as wire, erupted around his face. And we're going to take a moment to look at the description of his hair. It was described as wild gray hair, so it was unkempt. It was all over the place. So it was wild, and that is also an adjective. Gray is an adjective that gives us an idea of the color of his hair. And of course, that shows us that he's an older fellow. All right. But they extend this image with the use of, you guessed it, a simile. His hair was as stiff as wire. All right. And so when you write, you can utilize this as well. I'd also like to point out to you that there are many more examples of literary devices, and there are many more examples of adjectives in this passage. Why don't you check it out? Read through and see if you can create a table. One section with the adjectives, create another column for adverbs, and then create another column for your figurative devices. All right, and let's see. All right, so see you next time. Hopefully this video has been helpful. You take care.